being slashed. In the less than load industry known as LTL, carriers became less than profitable. A handful of carriers even exhibited predatory practices in an effort to topple YRC. At the time, YRC was the industry leader formed through the merger of the two largest LTL carriers, Yellow Freight and Roadway. At the time, YRC was struggling to survive with huge liquidity issues. So major carriers specifically targeted YRC customers with lost leader pricing to drive YRC out. Amazingly, it appears YRC has made it through the worst of times, although they're not out of the woods yet. We believe it's good for the market that YRC survives and they continue to get healthier financials. Needless to say, all of the price cuts led to huge losses for LTL carriers.
How about UPS? How did they fare during the downturn?
Even UPS and FedEx felt the squeeze, posting profits of about half what they'd been achieving in prior years. But don't feel too sorry for them. UPS profits may have dipped in early 2010, but only to around $500 million per quarter, and FedEx to about $250 million. Today they are back. In fact, UPS profits for Q1 were almost $900 million, and they are forecasting record profits for the year. Here are some recent headlines. Why is this important? According to UPS, they handle 6% of the U.S. GDP and 2% of the global GDP in their trucks and planes. So it's fair to say they're a bellwether of economic activity.
So as we start to see signs of life in the economy, how do things stand today?
Well, clearly things are looking up for logistics providers in 2011. Factory orders are up, everything from raw materials to finished goods are moving again, and the B2C channel continues to flourish. Although they still face many challenges, the balance of power has shifted back to the carriers. Simply put, there's a lot more demand than supply. So carriers are back with a vengeance. They see the new market conditions as a chance to make up for lost ground. The increase in demand coupled with limited assets create the perfect storm for shippers, the perfect opportunity for carriers to increase prices.
All right, at this point, we're going to throw up our first polling question. Keep in mind, there is a right answer, but you don't have to get the answer right to get credit. We'll take about 30, 45 seconds on this. Okay, we are back. Kurt, just following up with your discussion about increase in demand, are price increases inevitable?
Well, Ken, we think so. There's a strong upward price pressure across all modes of transportation, and shippers are already feeling it. Carriers can afford to be more selective, and they're turning down business. In some cases, they're even dropping customers where their OR, what they call their operating ratios, are too high. Of course, some industries are affected more than others. A company in the B2C world shipping exclusively small packages shouldn't have any problems getting picked up. The basis of the FedEx and UPS model is pickup and delivery density, so they better have a truck for you. It's also one of the reasons DHL couldn't compete. Likewise, a high-margin electronic component manufacturer may be not as pinched as a seasonal shipper in a low-margin business. For instance, we have a client in the nursery business. And in the nursery business, the focus is on planting trees and shrubs, and it's very seasonal, mostly happening in a 6 to 8 week period each spring in the Northeast. The nursery industry has been hit hard by lack of trucking capacity. Load volume continues to set records, and capacity remains tight in most markets. With a load-to-truck ratio of 10 loads per available truck nationwide, trucking companies have simply found better, easier to handle business elsewhere. With perishable live product, one anonymous grower reported, "I have loads sitting on the dock for days while we look for trucks. I'm at the point where I'll pay anything to service the customer, but there's always somebody more desperate and willing to pay more than I am." Some of the challenges facing trucking companies include severe driver shortages. An owner of a prominent trucking company complained, "Some drivers who we laid off are still collecting unemployment and are reluctant to come back to work before their benefits run out." Analysts are predicting a shortfall of as many as 400,000 drivers as early as 2012. For truckers, new restrictive hours of service regulations have reduced the number of hours a driver can operate a vehicle without rest. And of course, this keeps capacity tight and further raises costs for carriers and ultimately to you as shippers. And then there are rising insurance rates, rigid emissions requirements, and safety requirements to contend with. The list goes on and on.
And isn't the rising cost of fuel a major culprit?
Absolutely. Fuel costs are an issue across the board. A senior executive at one of the largest trucking companies in the country recently shared that their studies show that for the first time in history, the cost of fuel is now more than the cost of a driver on a per-mile basis. If you think your gas mileage is lousy, how about 44 feet to the gallon, or about 120 gallons per mile? That's what a typical container ship gets. Not surprisingly, shipping lines have moved to slow steaming to save on fuel, and it allows them to keep demand artificially higher. Carriers that have mothballed ships are also reluctant to put them back in service. A new generation of super container ships now being developed will have top speeds lower than with the current designs. Cutting fuel consumption has taken priority over speed of delivery. With fuel prices likely to remain higher long term, ultimately ocean carriers will continue to be the preferable mode for importers. So as bad as the mileage numbers seem, it's simply a matter of the tonnage they can move per gallon. For the same reason, we think the big winner domestically will be the railroads and intermodal marketers. You may have seen the CSX ads they call "How Tomorrow Moves," boasting while a car that gets 50 miles to the gallon may be good for the environment, CSX trains move a ton of cargo 423 miles per gallon. In the air freight world, both acts of God and acts of terrors are playing major roles. Last year, the volcano in Iceland with the impossible name provided a stark reminder of just how vulnerable global commerce is to unpredictable events. In addition to stranding millions of travelers and causing the airlines billions of dollars in losses, the eruption created chaos in international air freight, leaving companies around the world unable to access needed parts or deliver finished goods. The joke is that when Iceland's economy died, its last wish was to scatter its ashes over Europe. With up to 20,000 flights canceled each day, that ash was the only thing being distributed throughout much of the EU for one hectic week.
And didn't the tsunamis in Japan have similar effects?
Even greater. The impact from the devastating earthquakes and resultant tsunamis claimed thousands of lives. In fact, the lingering effects are still causing problems and profound interruptions for many suppliers and manufacturers and crippling some very resilient JIT supply chains like Apple's. Of course, we also can't ignore the role terrorism has on our supply chains. A shudder went through the international air freight system at the end of October when it was discovered that terrorists in Yemen had used UPS and FedEx to ship packages containing bombs headed for Chicago. The multi-billion-dollar air cargo industry carries millions of time-sensitive packages every day, everything from fresh flowers to industrial repair parts. Security experts say a requirement for checking every package, a system that already exists in place for shipments on passenger planes, could bring the entire air freight industry to a halt. It could also lead to a major rate increase as carriers look to recoup their additional security costs. State-of-the-art screening devices can be up to $10 million apiece, and ultimately the cost will be borne by the end user. This is one of many growing concerns about manufacturing overseas that could accelerate a trend towards domestication or onshoring, making U.S.-based production a more attractive option for U.S.-based firms and cutting into offshore sourcing. Any successful terrorist attack using international air freight will dramatically disrupt deliveries worldwide. The Yemen attack, along with the shutdown of services caused by natural disasters, highlight the vulnerability of the global distribution network. In supply chain planning, in addition to just in time, it's important to look at just in case.
So Kirk, are there measures our participants can take to combat these pressures?
Well, in a word, yes. In both the short and long run, added costs have implications for supply chain decision makers. Companies must manage their inventories more carefully. For instance, adding things like more buffer stock to offset longer lead times. And increased fuel costs mean transportation becomes a much larger share of finished goods costs. These are factors you must take into consideration. So what should you do? I'd suggest you keep it simple. No one knows how to approach things in your organization better than you do. Start with a self-logistics diagnostic. Review your processes. Review what you're doing today and what you should be doing. Then do an honest self-assessment of where you need to improve. Quantify the areas of opportunity and prioritize them. Lay out a roadmap and build a sustenance plan. Determine what you can do in-house and what you should outsource. We would suggest start with contract management. In contract management, you should utilize leverage to develop and maintain carrier relationships to minimize cost, improve control, and deliver better service. Why start with contract management? Remember, almost 50% of logistics costs are transportation. Some key areas to be evaluated. Have you reviewed your current mix of carrier by mode? Are your rates competitive? What sort of exposure do you have to accessorial charges? Are you aware of the terms under which you are doing business? Do you understand the rules tariffs you're operating under? What are your fuel surcharge provisions? Are volume incentives met and leveraged?
Kirk, do CFOs get involved in these decisions?
Ken, that's a great question. They are getting much more involved these days. In the old days, logistics decisions were simply left to the shipping guy or the transportation manager. But a lot of these decisions are far too important for that. CFOs don't need to wade into the daily transactional activity, but they do play a very important role in strategic decisions. They also recognize the value of high-level metrics to be sure they're heading in the right direction. Does that answer your question, Ken?
Yep.
Okay, good. So here are some major areas of opportunity within contract management. It's an opportunity to renegotiate your price service packages, to establish core carrier programs, and evaluate carrier compliance.
Great, Kirk. At this point in time, we are going to have our second polling question. One of the things I want to announce to you is that when you click the radio button, your selection will be recorded. This is just a reminder about submitting questions. Reminder, we are taking questions during the presentation, so if you have a question, please submit it. During this last break, we did get a question that I'm going to offer up to Kirk. Given the high gasoline prices affecting trucks and 18-wheelers, could we see increased railway usage due to the efficiencies the industry has garnered?
It's a great question. Thank you for submitting it. I think the answer is absolutely yes. As I mentioned a little earlier, we think that the big winners in this are likely to be that the rail companies and the intermodal marketers,